Okay, welcome everybody. This is Mike Maddox. I'm the CEO of ASK. We've got a couple of people on. I'm going to get started in just 1 second with the webinar. Thank you for joining us today. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. A couple of housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded today. All microphones except mine. Hopefully mine's not muted. All the other microphones are muted. We will be taking questions and answers via the chat function. So if you have a question you want to ask as I go through this, please put it into the chat. We've got a couple of people on with me that'll try to answer questions as we go through. Any that they don't answer, I will try to answer at the end. And of course, if you're an existing ASK customer, you can certainly contact your client technology manager, who would be happy to get you more information on anything we talk about today. Or reach out to me, or I'll give you a couple other contacts at the end of the presentation that you can reach out to get questions answered if they come up afterward. The title of today's webinar is IT Review, How to Ensure You're Not Wasting Money on IT. This is a critical question for many business owners. Technology is an area of the business that we often, as owners, are not as closely associated with or have our hands on as much as we would like to. So how do you make sure that you're not wasting money on IT, and how do you make sure that the money that you are spending is providing a return? We're going to try and take this from a real high level. I'm going to set the stage in the beginning a little bit for how we look at this. When we work with clients, ASK, we're in our 28th year now, so we've been doing this for a long time. And I'll try to set the stage for how we look at it and give you enough information to take back into your organization and do your own analysis and evaluation. Certainly can't go too deep into this topic. It would take more than an hour, but we're going to try to get the important points. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and roll on into the presentation. The agenda for the presentation is we'll start with some definition of investing versus spending. What is the difference between those two? Because they are two very different things. And try to define that in terms of technology. Also, what is ROI? And when you talk about ROI in the technology sense, how do you look at it? What are the components of it? What goes into it? What are some numbers? Budgeting and why it's important to have an IT budget, a proactive budget, and what goes into that and how to establish that, how to get your hands around how much that should be, what items to include in it, and then how do you measure the success of the investment that you've made? How do you get to the ROI number? How do you understand if it's actually an investment that is helping move your business forward? And then finally, we're going to talk about some questions you can take back and discuss with your IT staff or your CFO or whoever's responsible for IT in your company to identify whether there are red flag areas or things that you should be looking at or dive into further. So that's kind of the agenda. And as I mentioned, we'll have questions and answers at the end as well via the chat function. So investing versus spending. Let's talk about the difference between those two. And for us, when we work with businesses, it comes down to a reactive or proactive approach. Having done this many times with many customers over the years, we see both approaches, and they are very different when it comes to technology. The reactive approach is one that is quite common for businesses that are not yet being as proactive as they'd like to be in the area of technology. And it involves things like addressing problems as they arise. So as critical issues come up or problems creep up in the environment, that's when you spend the money or buy the piece of equipment or do what you need to do to kind of solve the problem. It's at the moment of crisis. Our reactive approach also involves a set it and forget it practice for antivirus and things like Microsoft patches. Antivirus software is something that has to be updated constantly. to be effective. Otherwise, the viruses that make their way in, the virus software doesn't know anything about it. And so with patching and antivirus software, you can just set your systems to automatically deploy those patches and roll them and update your antivirus on a regular basis. But that's a reactive approach, and I'll talk about in a minute why a more proactive method is probably wiser in that area. A reactive approach also involves buying equipment when users complain. So when the laptop gets to the point that you have to tie a rubber band around the top so that the screen is visible, or you know that the X key doesn't work, those kinds of things, that's when you buy new equipment. But basically when users are coming forward and saying they can't do certain functions and they need new equipment, that's a reactive approach. Similar to buying equipment or solutions when the request comes in. And often you end up buying redundant solutions or redundant technology items in that kind of an approach. And finally, and probably most importantly, in a reactive environment, there's no evaluation of risk. What risk is your organization under from cyber threat and outages and data loss? That, as I said, is very different than a proactive approach, which involves remote monitoring and managing the environment. RMM is an acronym used for that. Remote monitoring management simply means that you have the tools and the people available to watch over the environment, identify issues before they become business impacting, remediate them before they impact your business. When it comes to Microsoft patches, the tools and the people are able to test the patches that are deployed by Microsoft and deploy them in an intelligent way. And what I mean by that is Microsoft's patches are rolled out in order to close security risks, very real threats to the organization that Microsoft knows are there. And so they deploy patches on a regular basis. As new threats emerge, Microsoft patches those threats, rolls them out to the user environment. But the problem with that is that often a Microsoft patch kit will break things as well as patch the things it's intended to patch. So it may conflict with existing line of business software or other parts of your IT operation and cause more problems than it seems to help. So the best way to do that is to test those patches before they go into your environment and understand what the impact is going to be and what the patch is intended to do. But that takes tools and that takes people and that takes a process. Same thing for antivirus. Antivirus should be updated ideally every 3 to 4 hours every day. That's the speed of cybercrime and viruses in today's world and environment. A proactive approach has the tools and the people that are able to do that. Asset management, understanding what computer assets you have in your environment, what laptops, desktops, servers, network gear, what software resides on them, what their purchase date was, what their expected lifespan is. Are they under maintenance, not under maintenance? That takes, again, tools and people that are able to accomplish that. But that's a more proactive way of managing your environment. Most importantly is aligning your business strategy to your IT purchases. And that's something we'll get into in the upcoming slides, the next couple slides. But a proactive environment is focused on making sure that the IT function is directly aligned with the business strategy. And finally, establishing your recovery time objective and recovery point objective and your cyber risk mitigation plan. And I've got a couple slides in the presentation on those topics, so I'll get into those in a little more detail. As far as being proactive and establishing a budget, the way that we do this and working with clients, we've developed at ASK a process we call our technology alignment process. And the technology alignment process is really focused on 3 foundational pillars here at the bottom of this slide. The first one is having a managed IT system. And that's many of the things I talked about earlier, having the tools and the people that can monitor and manage the environment on a proactive basis to identify issues before they become business impacting. Having the tools and the people who are able to vet and test the Microsoft patch kits, the antivirus updates, and the changes that occur in the environment and apply them in an intelligent and planned way. That's a foundational piece of a good IT environment. And that's one of the foundational pillars. High availability and disaster recovery simply means your ability. Do you have the tools and the processes in place to recover in the event of a disaster or some kind of an outage? Every business is going to incur some kind of an outage or a disaster at some point. And what do you have in place that ensures that you can get the business back up and running, get your data back, and do it in a timely fashion? Those are very foundational. Up until about 10 years ago, these two pillars here were the foundation of good IT. And that's what ASK did for many years with their clients, was focus in those two areas, and that was the solid foundation. About 10 years ago, the world changed, and we started to see the proliferation, if I could speak a little bit today, proliferation of cybercrime in businesses of all sizes. And it's only grown exponentially, and you all know that. If you watch the news or you may have been affected by it, it's everywhere, and it grows exponentially year after year after year. So the third pillar became critically important, and that is a proactive cybersecurity protection program. So these are the three foundational pillars that need to be in place. Once they're in place, the technology alignment process comes into play. And for us, it always begins with, what are the pain points in the organization? What are the parts of the organization that are inefficient, maybe have redundant processes, maybe are paper-based, maybe where there's lack of collaboration, lack of communication? And this is often an area that is surprisingly easy to identify through talking to users and doing surveys with staff. They will tell you, when we go into an environment and we do an analysis or an onboarding engagement, and we have these conversations with users, they're very quick to tell you where the pain points are. And it's relatively simple to start to identify areas of inefficiency. And it's usually a little surprising to most of us, how many there are in the organization. But it starts there. From there, you get into strategic planning. What are the strategic plans for the organization in the coming month, 3 months, year, 3 years, 5 years? Where is the organization heading? What are the goals and objectives? And how do we align technology to the strategic plan of the business? From there, we move into road mapping, which is simply mapping out over time, over the next quarter, year, 3 years, 5 years, technology solutions that can support the strategic plan and alleviate the pain points. And that's how you develop a roadmap. From roadmap, we put a budget together, and a budget is simply putting numbers to the items that are identified in the roadmap. Of course, you then start to implement over time the solutions that you've identified. And critically important, as we'll talk about today, is the return on investment measure. So, taking the time to look back and say, we went through this process, the money that we spent, did it provide us with an adequate return on our investment in technology? And those are the foundational pieces for how you go about a proactive plan and budget. We like to say at ASK that technology on its own has no intrinsic value for a business. So technology for the sake of technology has no value in the business world. Its value comes from its ability to alleviate pain points, get rid of inefficiency, make people more productive, and to support the strategic plan or the growth of the business. And it can do that and does that well if you follow a process like the one I've outlined. Budgeting. So we talk a little bit about budgets, and to kind of just frame budgeting a little bit, I want to talk about how you can look at spending in IT. And this came out of conversations that we had with many of our clients on the level of spend, because often IT, if you're used to a reactive approach, seems like just a bottom line hit, and it's more than that. Technology for every business today is a foundational component of your success. And I started to look at our own company and then compared this with many of our clients and asked, what do you spend on coffee and soda for the staff? Snacks in the break room. What do you spend on printing on a monthly basis? What do you spend on cleaning services? Having somebody come in and clean the office space, and on office supplies. And I was surprised to learn that all of us were spending well over $125 per month per staff member on just, these seemingly benign areas of the business. And we were spending less than that in some cases on technology, which is a foundational element. So I point that out just to give you a little bit of frame of reference. To give you some specifics on spend, there's a couple of statistics I'd like to share with you. Small and medium-sized companies often outspend larger ones, and that's as a percentage of their revenue. The average small company, and in the study that I'm referring to by Alinion, and then the second one was done by Deloitte, they defined a small business as less than $50 million in annual revenue. The average small company spends 6.9% of their revenue on IT. Mid-sized companies spend 4.1%, and larger companies spend 3.2%. That's because as you get larger, you develop some economies of scale, and you're able to spend a smaller percentage, probably a higher dollar amount, but a smaller percentage. Most importantly, in the Deloitte study that was done, is that they found that higher performing companies, those that consistently outperformed their competition or the S&P, 57% of them increased their budgets annually. And they weren't doing this in the study just whimsically. It wasn't just an automatic budget increase year on year. It was done because of an investment approach. They were able to identify the ROI. They were able to identify how technology was helping drive their business forward. And they were very happy to increase that spend in order to continue that cycle. And that was a study done earlier this year by Deloitte, as I mentioned. Return on investment. So we get into measuring return on investment. It's first important to define or look at how do you define return on investment when it comes to technology. The first part of defining return on investment for technology is cost elimination. And then secondly is productivity gain. And lastly is risk mitigation. Cost elimination, outages, downtime, getting rid of those or minimizing those, minimizing the amount of time staff spends on troubleshooting their own IT issues or areas of inefficiency. System issues, inefficiency is the last one. Productivity gain, finding technology solutions that will help align your IT tools and your business strategy together. That increases efficiency, and that can be a huge area for return on investment. And we'll show you some examples on an upcoming slide here. Risk mitigation also is another big area where there's real money involved as far as a return on investment perspective, and we'll talk about that as we get into the upcoming slides. So some numbers. If we look at productivity, I mentioned we were going to get into that because there are big numbers there. As far as ROI is concerned, a study done recently, in fact, earlier this year, showed that workers on average in the U.S. Lose 22 minutes per day due to issues with technology. Robert Half put this study out. So doing some basic math on that, there's 262 working days in 2020. If workers are losing 22 minutes per day due to issues with technology, that means that on average in the US, companies are losing 96 hours per year per employee. And so doing some further math on that, you can take the number of employees in your organization and multiply that by their average hourly full compensation rate. And all we did here was take their salary plus benefits, their fully funded compensation, divide it by 2,080, which are the number of working hours per year, and multiply that by the number of employees times 96 wasted hours. And that will give you the wasted dollars in your company. The technology issues, if you're an average company, that's what the Half study showed. As an example, you take a 50-person company with an average fully funded annual fee per employee, fully funded rate of $50,000. Yours may be more, maybe less in number of employees or the average fully funded rate. But if in this example, if you had a 50-person company with an average FTE of 50,000, that would result, doing the math in the above equation, in over $115,000 in loss per year, just due to inefficiency. So there are real numbers involved in looking at that area and establishing an ROI. I mentioned risk mitigation is another really big area, and just to set the stage for that, a study done by IBM and Ponymon together, and another one done by Fundera earlier this year, said that the average cost of a data breach in the United States is $8.19 million. That's the average cost. The thing about that number is that it increases exponentially year after year after year. A couple of years ago, the studies that I was reading were saying, 2.6 million last, and then it jumped up to 4.8. It's up to 8.19. It's just going to continue to rise because cybercrime is on an ever accelerating cycle, and the methods they use are getting more and more complex. Roughly 30% of organizations will suffer at least one breach in the next 2 years. So that's a statistic you often hear people in our industry say it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. I mean, we are all potential victims of this, even with good proactive cybersecurity, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But needless to say, it's out there, and it's a very real threat to all of our businesses. The study also showed that the average cost to remediate ransomware, that's not the total cost of a ransomware attack, that's just to clean up the mess, was $700,000 if you don't pay the ransom. So ransomware encrypts all your computers and your systems, locks them down. You get a nice little message on your screen saying, we'll gladly unlock all your data and give you access back to your systems if you pay us X amount of Bitcoin. If you choose not to pay, which is what we recommend, the average cost was $700,000. And if companies that chose to pay, the average cost was $1.4 million. That's a little counterintuitive. The reason that it's more expensive if you choose to pay really comes down to three things. Number one, you're working with criminals to begin with, so they may or may not give you your data back if you pay the ransom. It shouldn't be a surprise that the ethical standards in the cyber criminal world are not extremely high. Number two, if you do choose to pay, you've identified yourself on the dark web and in the world of cybercrime as a company that's willing to pay the ransom if you're infected. So chances are somebody else is going to infect you. And number three, almost always, if you get hit with ransomware, the criminals behind it are going to, even if they unencrypt your data and give you everything back for the ransom that you paid them, they're going to leave themselves a backdoor, another method to get back in. You've shown them that you're willing to pay, they're going to come at you again. May not be immediately, but eventually they will. So, one of the things I hear often in talking with business groups and business owners is, I'm a small business. I'm really not at that great a risk for cybercrime. And that's a myth that I like to talk about as much as I can, because the opposite is actually true. 60% of small businesses go out of business within 6 months after falling victim to a data breach or cyber attack. That statistic has been consistent, between 55 and 65% for a long time. These attacks are real, they're devastating, and they can happen to any of us. Smaller organizations also experience a higher proportion of cybercrime costs as a percentage of their revenue. So they can't absorb the kind of costs and the kind of damage that is done, as well as a large multinational or publicly traded company. So that's no surprise. Over 40% of cyber attacks are targeted at small business. That surprises a lot of people. So the cybercrime world knows where they want to attack, and because they travel at the speed of light, they can hit everybody. They can hit big businesses, small businesses, but they know in general that small businesses are less likely to have proactive cybersecurity measures in place. So that's where they tend to spend a lot of their time and effort. And then lastly, Real important to point out is that there's more potential bad news on this horizon. GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation that was put in place in the European Union in 2016, holds businesses accountable to protect their data and to protect their environment. And there are heavy fines associated with not having proactive measures in place and policies and processes to assure that kind of protection. In the US, we've started to see that concept spread. In California and a couple other states have already implemented GDPR-like regulations. There's talk of a GDPR-like set of regulations coming out of the federal government, and there's also talk about it being driven on a state-by-state level. But there are heavy fines associated with it, so it's something to be aware of. And then in the world we're living in today with COVID-19, I have to point out that it's interesting, we've all moved, for the most part, most of us have moved to remote work environments. So our staff is spread out in their home offices. And what that has done, it's allowed us to continue to operate, and in many cases operate efficiently, and we've learned a lot of great lessons, but it's also vastly increased our threat exposure. So our threat landscape of our business has become spread out. And that's really not surprising if you think about the fact that your staff is no longer sitting in your office behind a firewall or behind policies. They're now sitting in a home office environment with a router that they bought at Best Buy or Circuit City, and using a home office quality internet connection. It's a cyber criminal dream come true. The whole business world is spread out now and kind of easy to attack. And there are heavy costs associated with that. So that's something to be aware of. So how do you measure return on investment? So first thing to ask is, what things do you measure? And it comes down to, we believe, really 5 major areas. Revenue enhancements, by implementing technology or aligning it to your business process and then spending the money in an investment fashion to support those business processes and that business strategy. Can you enhance revenue? And that would be through things like new products that you can bring to market, higher customer satisfaction, increase sales. That's one area. Cost reduction refers to the benefits that will help you reduce costs, not necessarily eliminate costs, but reduce costs. Examples would be increasing efficiency of your operations, reducing steps, taking an 8-step process and reducing it down to a 2-step process through better collaboration or efficiency. Just even increasing communication internally or with your clients is a way to achieve cost reduction. Cost avoidance is eliminating costs. So that's areas where you can just get rid of costs completely. And that can be things like eliminating waste, eliminating errors, reducing the number of customer support issues, which are directly attributable to cost avoidance. Capital reduction and avoidance comes down to areas of the business where you can reduce or eliminate costs. That could be things like eliminating the amount of storage capacity you need in your IT environment because of better practices, policies, and IT tools. Or it can even mean eliminating your capital acquisition costs for servers and infrastructure. The cloud, Microsoft Azure, hybrid clouds, those are great areas and emerging areas that businesses are moving to rapidly in order to avoid that capital acquisition cost that happens on a regular and continual basis and move to more of a utility type computing model where they pay for what they need when they need it. They can scale it up, scale it down. It's a different mindset. It's an operational cost as opposed to a capital acquisition. So those are areas to look at when you measure ROI. How do you measure it? I want to just comment on this. It's important that you dig into both the hard dollars and the soft dollars. And that's no different for technology than it is for any other ROI measure. In technology, the soft dollars may be a little bit harder to identify. So if you increase client satisfaction, a certain percent. What does that mean as far as dollars go? That's a little harder to identify. But I would argue that in every area of our business, as we try to identify ROI, we have to make some educated estimates, and IT is the same. And you can estimate things in that fashion by looking at a number of hours saved, what your average employee fully funded rate is, what's the value of a client, and if you've increased it by a certain percent, put some numbers to it. I would always argue that you are conservative in your math because you're talking about spending real money. But even conservative numbers will show you that there are ROI that can be achieved through looking at both hard and soft dollars. And ultimately, all return on investment is measured the same way: gains minus cost divided by the cost. And then you measure that against your expected return for what you spend in your business. So what did you spend? What did we gain through what we spent? What did it cost us? Subtract those two and divide by the cost, and you get a percentage of your ROI. Last part of the session I want to talk about is things that you should ask your IT staff. Or your CFO or whoever in the environment is responsible for managing the IT function or accountable for IT. Or if you are that person, questions you need to ask yourself or look at in your own department. And we've put these together through doing assessments with customers of all industries and all sizes. And you'll have these at the end of the presentation. And they're really important to look at. So for example, in the first pillar of having a solid managed, proactive, monitored IT environment, if you remember the 3 pillars I talked about, this is the first pillar. Questions are things like, do we have a system in place to proactively identify issues in our network before they become business impacting? What do we have in place that will prevent viruses, malware, and email compromise? How is support handled today for our employees? So if a staff member has an issue with technology, is not able to be efficient in their job, are they left to their own devices? Is there a support desk staff? If so, how long does it take to get an issue resolved? Dive into some of those questions and you'll find whether you're efficient or not efficient. Do we have a tool that can quickly identify all of our active and inactive assets? That's a big area. Do we know where all of our laptops and desktops are, how many that we have, what software runs on them, what operating system runs on them? Are the operating systems current? Are they under warranty? If something goes bad and a drive fails, do we have a maintenance agreement that allows a 4-hour response? And that requires a tool and somebody to manage it. How do we deploy security patches? I talked about that earlier. Do we have a set it and forget it practice, or are we actually putting some intelligence into it and looking at the impact before we roll it out? Is there a report that can show the effectiveness of our IT investment over the past year? I mean, maybe this has been done already. Has anybody studied how effective our IT spend has been over the last year, 2, 3 years, to determine if we're getting some kind of a return on our spend? Is the strategic plan for how IT will support the business initiatives over the coming year? Is there a strategic plan? So has IT even been involved in the strategic plan? Does IT even know what the strategic plan of the business is? Those are important questions to ask to identify whether you should dig into an area or not. Have we surveyed our staff? And I talked about this earlier, to find out the main areas of frustration, areas of inefficiency. And a simple survey through SurveyMonkey or even just walking around will uncover a treasure trove of information on this question. And maybe it's already been done. It's a question to ask as a business leader. In the area of high availability and disaster recovery, I touched on this briefly at the beginning of the presentation. There really are only 2 questions that you need to ask. One is, what is our RPO? And RPO basically is your recovery point objective. That's how much data your business can stand to lose without catastrophic consequences. And that is different for every business. Some businesses can, stand to lose a day's worth of data. And they can recover because they have some kind of manual backup process, or because they've classified their data and, and they understand where the critical data is and where the non-critical data is. Some businesses can lose a couple hours. Some businesses can't lose any. They have a zero RPO. But have we, as a business, have we talked about that? That's a business strategy discussion. That's not a technology discussion. Have we identified what our recovery point objective is? And then secondly, and more importantly, what solutions do we have in place to ensure that we can meet this objective? And have we tested them? Have we done a test to see that we can actually meet that standard? And the second question is recovery time objective. Recovery time is how long it takes you to get back in operation if and when you sustain an outage. So your critical server goes down, a critical part of your network infrastructure goes down, and you have to recover. Are you operating under a process that means that you have to order a new server to be delivered to your environment? You have to set it up. You have to load the operating system. You have to load the data. You have to give the users the right access to it. That can be a 5 to 10 day process in today's day and age. Have we looked at that? Or do we have tools and solutions in place that allow us to recover in a much quicker fashion? What is the goal for our business? And again, it varies. I talk to some businesses and some industries that say, hey, we could be down for a couple of days and we could still do a lot of things with clients and we'd be okay. Other businesses have a zero RTO and they have, hot swappable, immediately cut over type solutions in place that are more expensive. But that's what the business requires. And again, it starts with the business question. What is our RTO? What does the business need? And then again, what solutions do we have in place that ensure that we can meet it? And have we tested them? Proactive cybersecurity is an area I said is one that you have to look at when you're talking about return on investment. And the questions that I would ask in this area come down to, what proactive tools have we put in place to protect the organization from cyber threat? And I have to make a note here. The answer that we get back often when we ask this question is, well, we have a firewall, and this is the brand that we have. We've got this kind of antivirus. We have this kind of anti-malware, this kind of email protection. And I want to be just really clear on this. Those are great solutions that you absolutely need. They're necessary, but they're not sufficient. They're reactive by nature. All of those tools exist to catch a virus or malware or ransomware once it's already in the environment. And sometimes they catch them, sometimes they don't. Depends on how up to date you are. It depends on how new the malware or virus is, but they're reactive. Proactive cybersecurity protection is much different. It identifies and looks for threats before they get in and stops them before they affect your environment. And so the question is, do we have any proactive tools? And have we, what are they? Secondly, have we trained our staff so that they understand the risks associated with cybercrime? And the reason that's so critically important is cybercrime still comes down to people. The greatest vulnerability for any of our organizations is always going to be our people. We're the ones that are going to click on the link in the attachment or open the email link that we shouldn't open, or go to the website and put data in that we shouldn't be putting in, unbeknownst to us. And it's really important to have ongoing training around cybersecurity so that your users understand what to do if they make a mistake, and then also why it's important. Getting buy-in from your staff is vitally important in cybersecurity. And when we do training sessions for our clients on cybersecurity, we do staff training. We always point out that the number one reason that you want to know about this is you're helping to protect the organization, which will protect your job. I mean, we should all be in it for that reason. But beyond that, if you think about it, your employer has more data on you than almost anybody. They have your social security number, your driver's license number. They have they have everything on you. And your data is in that massive data that will get stolen if there's not adequate cybersecurity protection in place. So there's a vested personal interest for employees as well. Have we had an outside security assessment done? The probably number one piece of advice I give business owners when I meet them for lunch or we have conversations is, if you're worried about cybersecurity, the first thing I would do, and the first thing I did for ASK, in fact, was have an outside security assessment done. I wanted to know, where are the areas of weakness? Where are the areas of vulnerability? What are the things that we need to pay attention to first? And then we want to roadmap out a plan to mitigate those areas. And you can do that most successfully by having somebody with an objective point of view come in and do an assessment. Do we have a password policy in place? So is our staff using the same passwords that they use on their home systems or on their personal applications and websites? Are they using the same ones in the business environment? Are they using the same password, single password, for everything they do? Or have we as a business set up policies and practices that mandate complex passwords, that they get changed on a regular basis? Have we provided our staff with a password management tool so that it makes it less cumbersome and easier for them to manage the necessary complexity in password policy? Is that in place today? Do we have multi-factor authentication in place? And multi-factor authentication, if you don't know the term, simply refers to more than one way to identify you are who you say you are. So you go to an application, a business critical application that you're using, you put in your ID and your password, and then you have to prove you are who you say you are through an additional step. And that could be a text message to your phone. It could be through an authenticator app on your phone, a fingerprint. There's a variety of ways to do it. That is not an expensive solution to implement at all. In many cases, it's already there. It just usually isn't done because it takes an extra step. But studies have shown that by simply implementing multi-factor authentication, you remediate, like phishing as an example, like 97% or something in that neighborhood. It's a huge thing for all businesses to look at. Lastly, on this slide, what are the areas of our business that are most vulnerable right now? And do we have a plan to mitigate these risks? So do you know what those areas are? Every business that we work with, and ourselves included, we all have risk areas. Cybersecurity protection is not a 100% game. It's about mitigating risk. And so do we know where the biggest exposures are? And do we have a plan to mitigate those exposures over time? So with that said, I want to point out a couple of resources that are available to you. These are all provided free of charge from ASK. The first URL is our website. And on that website, you'll find information on everything I talked about today, plus a bunch of other areas that might be of interest to you. The second one is our blog. And this podcast and all the slides associated with it will be posted to that link shortly after we get done with the live presentation. And you will also find on that blog a treasure trove of other information. We do a webinar about once a week at ASK, and we do it on everything from tools to make you more efficient, to how to combat cybercrime, how to implement multi-factor authentication, how to use the Microsoft suite or understand it better, how to conduct a training session for cybersecurity. There's a lot of stuff out there, and that's available to you as well. And again, none of these resources require you to put in your name, email, social security number, phone number. They're not out there as a tool for us to unleash our sales team on you. They're free of charge to the business community. So go ahead, log in and view the content. And then lastly, we do have a COVID-19 resource center that I'm very proud of. In that site, you will find all kinds of information on how to set up remote work environments, security concerns around the home office remote environment, and other type resources in our COVID-19 resource center. I mentioned that we do these webinars on a regular basis. The next one I'll give you a preview and ad for is on June 2nd. It's called Rediscovering the Power of Microsoft Outlook. Kevin Meeker, who's our Director of Business Development, is going to be putting that on at 1 o'clock on the 2nd of June. There's a registration link on this slide, and again, you'll get this after the presentation. So I would encourage you to register for that if you're interested in learning more about how to use that tool to be more efficient. I'm what they would call an Outlook power user, and I'm always amazed that I'm learning new things all the time, that Outlook has enormous tools available to you for efficiency and to streamline your operations and even your own work process. And if you're interested in that, Kevin will be talking about that on the 2nd. So with that, I'm going to pause and look for questions in the chat room. And so if you've posted some up there, maybe some have already been answered, and maybe some are still coming in. So we'll give it just a minute and give you time to put your questions up there. And I'll try to answer what I can. We'll give it a few minutes. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, if you want to take this information once it's posted and think about it and digest it, and you have questions, you can reach either myself, and my phone number, email address are both listed there, or Kevin Meeker, and his information is listed as well. Either one of us would be glad to get back to you with answers or information or clarification of anything I said if it wasn't clear. If you're an ASK client, of course, you can always reach out to your client technology manager, and they'd be glad to help you and answer any questions you might have. So I'm not seeing any questions posted, so that either means that they were answered already or there weren't any. So with that, I do want to thank you for spending the time today to be with us and to be a part of the webinar. Hopefully this has given you a high-level view of how to go about tackling return on investment and identifying if you're wasting money in IT or if you're spending money at an appropriate level. Very much appreciate your time. I hope you stay safe, stay healthy, and thank you very much. Have a wonderful afternoon.